Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are going to begin with another session on analysis of Sujatha Bhatt's poem, A Different History. So, in a way, this poem follows the ones that we have done previously, that is 29th April 1989 and 3rd November 1984. They are both related to past, they're both related to history, individual or national history. 29th April is about her personal history, the moment that marks a special day in her life when her daughter turned 3. And 3rd November 1984 is about the poet's deeply personal response to a well-documented, well-known event in history. We see her poetry. So one of the things that we see in her poetry is the way her poetry responds to history. At times involuntary, and at times she welcomes and dwells over the time, like in 29th April 1989, she dwells over the time. She welcomes that moment of lull, that moment of pause in her day-to-day life. So on the other hand, 3rd November 1984 is about her attempts to escape history, her attempts to escape the event, and yet how poetry is involuntarily caught within the cycle of history. So also notice that the poetry in both 29th April 1989 and 3rd November 1984 is not about event itself, but the poet's response to it. History, in this case, in these two poems, is deeply personalized, and in art, in poetry, the history is lived, right? It is lived, it's personalized, it's felt. So this brings me to the next point about the diasporic condition, right? The diasporic condition where she lives or she has made a home in a foreign land. She's living away from the country of her childhood, yet there is a strong connection in terms of culture, in terms of memories, as we saw in 3rd November 1984, her memories of the childhood, her memories of living and playing with children from different communities. But the diasporic condition shapes her response to history, and it shapes her poetry because it gives her a distanced and a detached point of view. She can view the events in a detached and holistic manner. So it, as I said last time, it is not about that, she is detached from the events. Her distance comes not from not caring or escaping, but her distance comes from, rather, her detachment comes from caring too much, right? So she's involuntary. She tries to detach herself, but she's involuntarily connected to the events happening in India. So there is a kind of a detachment, but that does not mean indifference. She also makes connections across the borders, and this is something that, again, her diasporic condition helps her to do so. She makes connections across borders, like when she sees the images of riots in India in New York Times, right? So there is an awareness that history or historical events are not bound by borders. That events, their impact, their experiences, and their memories can be felt far away. And I think this is a good point to turn to the poem A Different History. So the poem begins with a simple sentence, A Different History. It begins with a simple sentence, Great Pan is not dead. So very simple declaration, Great Pan, reference to Greek mythology, a Greek demigod, Pan, the satyr Pan, god of the wild, shepherds, the flocks, also the god of rustic music. And from the Great Pan, the term pantheism is derived. So the worship of nature, that is pantheism, is derived from Pan, and he's a god of the wild, shepherds, and also the rustic life. So in Greek iconography, Pan is portrayed as half goat, half man. He has hindquarters, legs, and horns of a goat. So, in a way, we can say, as a hybrid figure, part animal, part man, Pan is a perfect symbol of dual identity or a hybrid identity. His figures uh, shows that the subject is a product of different cultures, different histories, and it applies more so in a diasporic subject, where the identity is product of home and also the experiences in a foreign land. So, great Pan, part animal, part man, is a symbol of that, can be seen as a symbol of that dual or hybrid identity. According to Greek historian Plutarch, Pan is the only Greek god who actually dies, right? So that is another thing about Pan, that great god Pan is dead, or great Pan is dead, as Sujatha Bhatt begins her poem with. So it is a long story where the sailors hear the cry, "Great God Pan is dead." Maybe they hear wrongly, but for our sakes, we can say that there is a legend or a story that talks about the death of Pan. And the death of Pan has been discussed by several Western poets and writers, including Rabelais, G.K. Chesterton, John Milton, and Bhatt begins with this but begins with a denial of this legend. He says that she begins with great god Pan. She begins with great Pan is not dead. Right. So a grand declaration, which immediately moves to the next two lines, which are very simple, very conversational. Great Pan is not dead. He simply emigrated to India. So a movement from the grand declaration to a conversational tone, from mythology to geography. The word emigrated here the word emigrated here refers to migration, movement of populations, like she has migrated to America and then to Germany. But why does one move? There are push factors and there are pull factors. One moves because one is pushed out of one's homeland by shortages, poverty, conflict, or there is something in the foreign land that invites a person, maybe better life, better opportunities. So Pan has either been pushed out of his homeland, he has no place in the Greek and the Western civilization. Remember, Greek civilization is supposed to be, the basis, the foundation of Western civilization. So Pan has no place in the Western civilization anymore, with all the emphasis on science, technology, development. Mythology or mythical creatures have no place. And so he has moved to India. And so he has moved to India, as I said. Maybe he's also pulled by the fact that in India, he's pulled by the fact that in India, gods roam freely. That's what the next line points out, that here the gods roam freely, disguised as snakes and monkeys. So notice these two words here, freely, and then the contrast that's there in the word disguised. So immigration, but before we go there, just to discuss the word emigrated, just to kind of, to discuss it in a more holistic fashion. Emigrated, Pan has been forced out of his land. Pan has been thinks that he would fit better in India. It might also be an allusion to the colonial migration to India, the movement of the British to the east, pulled by the wealth of the east, the wealth of India. Notice the enjambment in these two sentences. He simply migrated to India. The enjambment. Also, the fact that to India stands, it dominates the third line, the emphatic declaration, the conversational tone in the following two sentences, and then the third line where, it So as I was saying, India stands out in the third line, dominating the opening of the poem. It is a destination where gods who have no place in the West anymore can go and fit, because here the gods roam freely. Right, so here, that is in India, she's locating the speaker of the poem in India. Here is India. Here the gods roam freely. So Pan is at home in India. India is a welcoming and inviting place, which has this inclusive culture with inclusive mythologies and legends. It is a place of refuge for those who have been pushed out of their native places, like the gods, like the Greek gods. So here the gods roam freely, disguised as snakes and monkeys. Notice a contrast, as I said, between freely and disguised. So the gods roam freely, but then there is also a constraint. They are disguised as snakes and monkeys. So there is a kind of a contradiction set up there in the two terms. It also shows that gods have to blend in the atmosphere, in the surroundings, right? So moving on, every tree is sacred, and it is a sin to be rude to a book. Again, the enjambment in the lines, but just going to line by line. Every tree is sacred. She's highlighting the pantheism. That is why Pan is at home here. She's highlighting the pantheism that characterizes a religion in India. Animals, plants, trees, they're all a part of, or they're all the symbols of the divine, and design is not up there somewhere in the heaven or wherever it is supposed to, wherever the god is supposed to be, but the gods roam freely, right? They live amongst the people, they live in nature, in animals, in plants. So it's a pantheistic culture, and it is no wonder that Pan feels at home here. Now from trees she moves to books. Every tree is sacred, and it is a sin to be rude to a book. So books made of paper that comes from trees are sacred, and so are the books. But books are also sacred because they are repositories of knowledge. So although there is freedom and divine exists freely amongst the humankind, there are also rules to be followed to respect the sacred or the divine spirit that is everywhere in the surroundings. It is sin to treat books badly. So it is a sin to be rude to a book. It is a sin to shove a book aside with your foot. A sin to slam books down hard on a table. A sin to toss one carelessly across the room. So it is a sin, as I said, it is a sin to treat books badly, and most of your Indian friends would tell you that they have learned this code of behavior, how to treat books. Books that record knowledge and impart it, books that are an account of history, culture, wisdom, and these actions that she lists here, to slam, to shove it with your foot, to toss it on the table, these are all gestures which convey disrespect. Also notice the word sin here. It is a sin, repeatedly a sin, right? So the repetition 3 times. So it is a sin to treat the books with these gestures of disrespect. So the sin brings in the first negative connotations here. It brings in the tension here. So from freely to now we have codes and rules of behavior, and there is a sin associated with this freedom. There is a code of behavior. The repetition conveys also the repetition. It is a sin. It conveys a sense of moral gravity. She goes on to list a set of behavior that constitutes sin, a set of behavior that signifies disrespect. And the don'ts, right? Don't shove a book, don't slam, don't toss. The don'ts are followed by the do's. What one should do, how to treat the books. That is the next image. You must learn how to turn the pages gently, without disturbing Saraswati, without offending the tree, from whose wood the paper was made. So as I said, from the don'ts to the do's. So turning the page gently, right? Notice these words, these terms that she uses, gently. This whole image kind of conveys this image of delicacy, which is in direct contrast with slamming and shoving and tossing. So turn the book's pages gently. So the disrespect in those harsh gestures and a kind of delicacy in this image of turning the pages gently. You must learn how to turn the pages gently without disturbing Saraswati. So here we have another god. Saraswati is the Indian goddess of knowledge and art. One must respect her. One must not offend the god. She is a one who, who would bless you with knowledge, wisdom, and also artistic skills, right? So without disturbing Saraswati, without offending the tree. Right here, notice the personification of the tree, offending the tree. So yeah, let me just so the personification in this image of offending the tree. So Bhatt is talking about codes of culture and codes of behavior that are respectful to one's surroundings. So the image of books dominate in this stanza. They are not just objects that are linked to they're not just objects which link past and present, man and nature. They also are linked to the theme of language, which is going to come up in the next stanza. But because books are written, you're right, books are written and they are written in a language. So books are intricately tied. Books cannot exist without language. So in that sense, it is important because the next stanza, as you can see here, is about language. But just finishing with the first stanza, there is a reference to the Greek god who has emigrated to India, who feels he fits in India because the divinity, the gods roam freely. It is a place where the gods who have no place, or the myths, mythologies, mythical creatures who have no place in the advanced Western civilization can fit. And here we see that the idea, it is not just a land of freedom. Of course, it is a land of freedom and acceptance, but also at the same time, there are codes of rule, there are codes of behavior. There is an expectation of respect, right? Not just for human beings, but also for trees or books, because as I said, in a pantheistic surrounding, in a pantheistic atmosphere, divinity, the divine, the god, pervades the surrounding. So whether it is a books which symbolize the goddess Saraswati, the goddess of art and knowledge, whether it is a books or whether it is a tree, there is a spirit of divinity that ties that ties nature and man, that ties man to man, or human being to human being for that matter. So the trees must be respected because from it books are made, and book in turn make us, right? They give us a sense of self, knowledge, wisdom. So books make us, and they're made of the trees must be respected without offending the tree from whose wood the paper was made. So that is the first stanza. We move on to the next one, and we have a break in this line of thought. The next paragraph begins with a rhetorical question, right? A rhetorical question, a question that does not seek to any answers, but the purpose of a rhetorical question is to make the listeners or the readers think. And this is what she wants the readers or the listeners to think about. Which language, and that's what she says, which language has not been the oppressor's tongue? Which language truly meant to murder someone? So the two rhetorical question, and here she raises the question about the nature of language, and we see that books are tied to language, as I said. So she comes to this idea of, or the theme of, language in this, but questions the nature of language. And also, language can be a medium of knowledge, a medium of wisdom, but at the same time, knowledge can also be the tool of oppression. The second question here, which language truly meant to murder someone? Right? The second question projects language as a human being. able to murder someone. So again, the personification of language as someone murderous. Here, the point she's trying to make is the dominance of one language or culture over the other. So, the dominance of one language which seeks to erase the other language. It is like a murder of a culture, a way of life, because as we see here, the books write in language and the books preserve history, preserve culture, preserve a way of life, preserve knowledge and wisdom. So, killing a language means killing that wisdom, killing that knowledge, killing that culture and way of living. So dominance of one language of the other seeks to erase the other language. It is like a murder of a culture, a way of life. It can be linked back to the first stanza where she's talking about a culture and civilization that is built on respect for the nature, for the surroundings, and a kind of openness so that the gods who have been ousted and displaced from the Western way of life can find refuge in India. So the second stanza turns to the violence of language. And here again, we come back to the idea of colonization, which was hinted in the second line. He simply emigrated. And here, as I said, emigration might also be a reference to the colonial migration to India, the movement of British to the east and particularly to India in this case. So this movement of the British, this colonization that India has suffered, and the violence of that colonization, and language being a tool of that violence. India is now dominated by another language, a language that represents the foreign culture, the British colonialism that has murdered, tortured the people, that has tried to eliminate and erase native language, native culture, native religion. But the question format, right? The question format makes it ambivalent, right? She's almost saying which language has not been the two oppressor's tongue, which language truly meant to murder someone. The format of a question, in a way, seems to ask whether it is like which language truly meant to do this. It seems to ask that language, something seemingly so harmless, so innocent, could do this. So this ambiguity characterizes the notion of language in the poet's mind. How could language, that is a source of wisdom, that is a source of knowledge, that is a source where people can communicate, how can language be murderous? How can language be oppressive? I think it is important to note here also the sudden onset of rhyme. The poem itself is in free verse. Look at the varying length of lines here in the first stanza. Almost, there is no rhythm. These are just thoughts these are just thoughts flowing out of the poet's mind. But these 4 lines here, right? These 4 lines here, it's almost as if this return of, or this rhyme, which language has not been oppressor's tongue, which language truly meant to murder someone. So there is a kind of a rhyme here. We see a rhyme here and tongue, yeah, and then of course language and language. So the sudden onset of the rhyme here, right? A, B, A, B, this rhyme pattern, it signifies the timeless nature of this ambiguity. Language, which is a source of wisdom and knowledge, but at the same time, its power is also to oppress, to erase others, to dominate others. So the language and its power has always been controversial. So she moves on to the third rhetorical question. How does it happen that after the torture, after the soul has been cropped, with the long scythe swooping out of the conqueror's face, the unborn grandchildren grow to love the strange language? So from wondering how could language be oppressive or murderous? Third question is slightly different. How does it happen? How conveys a kind of uncertainty, a sense of wonder? How does it happen? And the poem ends with a kind of extended metaphor. Language has been a tool of torture. How does it happen that after torture, after the soul has been cropped with the long scythe swooping out of the conqueror's face? Look at this image. Look at this. No, the language is like long scythe swooping out of the conqueror's face. It's like the tongue, but that tongue is also a scythe. Now, scythe is this tool, which is meant to crop, which is meant to cut, mutilate, torture, right? It is also an agricultural tool, and we'll discuss this ambivalent imagery in a while. But just to explain the metaphor, so how is it that the long scythe swooping out of the conqueror's face? So the conqueror is, of course, a colonizer. It crops the soul, right? It tortures people. It crops the souls of the people. It mutilates people, their souls. How does it happen that after all that happens, the unborn grandchildren grow to love that strange language? So the long scythe, language or tongue, in a way, the long scythe coming out of the conqueror's face, the tongue of the conqueror, the language of the conqueror. So language is like a weapon of conquest. It is a scythe, words, language, and the culture that it brings. These are weapons of war that the colonizer used to subdue people in colonies, like the British did in India. But what does it mean to maim and crop the souls? The cropping of the souls is synonymous to murder, the erasure of cultural values, the destruction of other way of life, destruction of one's roots, destruction of one's identity. So the poet uses this metaphorical image of the conqueror with a scythe cropping the souls. So the conqueror being, as I said, the colonizer, who with their power and violence, not direct violence, but indirect violence by the culture, by language, they murder indigenous people, they murder indigenous cultures. The language is like a scythe that chops off indigenous language and traditions, who can be seen as weeds, right? So later, after the mutilation of native identities, they implant the seeds of their own culture. Right after mutilating the identities in the colonies, the British or the colonizer plant the seed of their own culture. So, in contrast to the previous paragraph, where language is a means to knowledge, to record knowledge in books, to share knowledge through speech and written word, here language becomes a means of power and destruction in a godless world. Scythe is, the image of scythe reminds one of Grim Reaper, the death, and therefore scythe in a way symbolizes death. But this is also an agricultural tool. So scythe is used to reap the crops which help to nurture, which help to live and grow. So this ambivalence not only signifies conflict and murder and torture, but also a kind of regeneration, that life continues despite death, despite this mutilation. So this can be linked to the following lines: the unborn children who would no longer be speaking the language of the poet, her native language, Gujarati. They might no longer be speaking of Gujarati, because the native Gujarati has been maimed, tortured by the colonizer's language. It has been taken over by English. So the unborn children would no longer speak the language of the poet, but the language of the colonizer, right? And so English takes over. On the one hand, poet wonders, how is it possible that after the murder, the torture, the oppressed or the colonized embrace the language of the colonizer and the culture of the colonizer? How is it possible that the Indians not only speak English, but think that it's a better language, English culture is a better culture? How is it possible that this happened? But at the same time, it also envisions a hybrid culture where dual identities would give rise to different histories. And what do I mean by that? So on the one hand, she's wondering how can grandchildren of the people who had been tortured and maimed grow to love English, but at the same time, there is a sense of inevitability that things are going to change, that the grandchildren are going to be as Gujarati as they're going to be post colonial Indian children who are comfortable with English language, who speak English language, and for whom English is a part of their history and of their psyches and their identities. So, as I said, it envisions a hybrid culture. The grandchildren are going to possess a hybrid identity, right? They are going to be Gujaratis or as well as post-colonial Indian children who are comfortable with the language. And their history is neither the history of the colonizer, that is, it's not the history that the British would like to remember, but nor is it the history of the colonized. Their history is a different history. Their history is going to be a different history. They are going to be products of a hybrid history, a hybrid language. So, what starts as a question, right? How did it happen that these children grow to love the language? It starts with a question, but ends in a statement that the young will love this hybrid culture. They will belong to this hybrid culture, which speaks a hybrid language. So, from the understanding of language as a medium of knowledge, something sacred, something to be revered, to a weapon to be now in the end, now language becomes a symbol of inevitability of change and acceptance of change, right? So it is going to the future is going to be, or the history, or a different history. These children are going to be proponents of a different history, which is a hybrid history written in a hybrid language. To talk briefly about the structure of the poem, as I said, the poem consists of two irregular stanzas in free verse. The third person detached narrator, the persona narrating the poem is a third person detached narrator. Her diasporic condition gives her the detachment, and she wonders not only at the violence of the colonizer, but also at the acquiescence of the colonized. How and when and why did they give in, as she says in the last line, right? The title of the poem tells a history of colonization from the diasporic Indian's point of view, right? India is as an open, pantheistic civilization, a free civilization with its own rules of sacred codes of behavior, and how this was erased, murdered, mutilated by colonization, and then an acceptance that the future is going to be a hybrid future. So this is not the British history of colonialism, which talks about the benefits of civilization that the British brought to the colonies like India, how it modernized India, etc. Here she reveals how Indian civilization was open, welcoming, respectful, pantheistic. It followed a way of living that is different from the West, and those who did not fit in the supposed advanced civilization in the West found refuge in India. So India as a place that is kind and accepting. She talks about British colonialism not as a civilizing mission, but as a murderous mission that it really was. And she also, in the end, wonders at the acquiescence of the Indians or the natives. So instead of taking sides, she's trying to find out the reasons why a culture that was strong, open, and advanced in its own rights fell to the murderousness of the outsiders. It also talks about language as a tool of colonization. If you take away language, you take away literature, you take away scriptures, you take away a way of thinking. There is no place for Pan or Saraswati in English language, no place for codes and rules of behavior, no place for this particular kind of treatment of books. So destruction of language is a destruction of culture. And that is what happened as English came to dominate the colonial world. However, there is ambivalence at the end. The poem ends with the inevitability of this change, and also the notion that the future is going to be a hybrid one. History is not just shaped by the events, it is also shaped by the words. The British colonizers have shaped and told history in their own words. Indians have told history in their own words, talking about their freedom movements and the oppression by the British. But in future, it's going to be a different history, a hybrid history in a hybrid language that expresses the hybrid identity of the future generations. So in a way, we can all, this is a post-colonial poem written by a diasporic Indian writer. And with that, we come to the end of this session. I would be continuing the analysis of Sujatha Bhatt's poetry, and I would soon be starting a session or a series of videos on Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake. So if you are doing that, or if you need if you want to discuss that, please follow the channel. Thank you, and bye bye.